When I was a military police officer for the US Navy, I made a lot of arrests over and over again for the same things. A lot of domestic violence and a lot of alcohol related issues. And one night, after an especially high profile arrest overseas for a very violent crime, I shut the cell door on yet another suspect, only this time he was facing what amounted to a death sentence overseas for his crime, and he wasn't even yet 21, I think. But all the warnings in the world or education on the subject didn't deter him, and I began to wonder, why do we keep having the same problems despite the consequences or the information that's put out on it? The tragedies I saw in that crash stuck with me so much that I eventually earned my master's in counseling psychology trying to answer that question. I started out treating sex offenders. I spent time in one of the Oregon State prisons as a counselor. I spent time working with those who are adjudicated criminally insane in the Oregon State Hospital Sex Offender Treatment Program. And I finally ended up being a domestic violence evaluator for the state of Idaho. And now I'm what they call a domestic battery intervention direct service provider. I'm a therapist who treats those who were convicted of domestic violence related crimes as a part of their sentencing. And when it came to domestic violence, I began to see that both law enforcement and society are focused on the violent incident, but we're missing the fact that the abuse began long before that violent act. And I began to see that all of the signs and symptoms are right in front of us. There are a ton of red flags leading up to a domestic violence offense, but we aren't seeing them or paying attention to them or taking them seriously. And I began to recognize one factor as to why we don't see the red flags or take them seriously is that our culture does not emphasize healthy relationships. We actually pay for and are entertained by abusive relationships. We spend a lot of time focused on the abusive relationships of celebrities in our tabloid news. Movies are made about depraved and abusive sex or emotionally abusive relationships. Music often glorifies obsessiveness, jealousy, possessiveness, infidelity, and abuse. And yet so much of it is so subtle that we don't immediately recognize it. Also, large numbers of us grow up in abusive households and communities. Our frames of reference for healthy and unhealthy behaviors and relationships are often distorted from the beginning by the homes and neighborhoods we grew up in. So if we're comparing our relationships to an abusive upbringing, an abusive environment, or even dysfunctional entertainment, we're going to be missing the red flags that should warn us. So the question is, what are we missing? First and foremost, abuse is a pattern, not an incident. So again, law enforcement and society focus on the one violent act that we make an arrest for or are able to show in the news, and then we look at this as domestic violence and we want to stop that act. And we should, but this is only one part of the abusive relationship. And in fact, the worst abuse and damage occur well before the violent act. The violence is made possible by the abuse that precedes it. So abusive relationships can be divided into 3 stages, and we call this the cycle of violence. It's a cycle. It repeats itself. And the relationship often starts out appearing healthy and kind and supportive or wonderful, but at some point it enters the first stage called the tension building stage. Tension building is exactly that, escalating friction, conflict, hostility, antagonism, and suspense over time on the way to a violent act. Most common type of abuse in the tension building stage is emotional abuse, which provides the foundation for almost all other types of abuse against the victim. It's what begins the breakdown of a human being who ultimately becomes unable to stop the abuse. And it gets harder and harder for them over time. Their ability to stop it goes down and down and declines over time. And we define it as actions, statements, or gestures which are attacks on a victim's self-esteem and sense of self-worth. Any act that is intended to humiliate their partner. Examples of emotional abuse can be calling the victim derogatory names or referring to them as fat, stupid, or ugly. Abusers may take over activities when the victim's trying to do something, thereby treating them as stupid or incapable. They may compare them to others and how much better they are than the victim, or prevent the victim from developing skills and talents, call the victim's interests and talents dumb, stupid, boring, or a waste of time and money. They may emotionally isolate the victim by not informing them of issues in the relationship that affect them, or they may even make them ask for the necessities in the relationship. Make them ask. Anything that can be considered degrading to the victim is emotional abuse. But emotional abuse is how the victims begin to be trapped in an abusive situation, as it reduces their self-esteem or their confidence to set boundaries over their bodies or their lives, protect themselves, or even leave an abusive relationship. Other examples of abuse are controlling the finances or denying the victim resources to take care of themselves so they don't look their best, or may be ashamed to go out in public or apply for a job or support themselves or their family. There's also often threats of harm, not just physical, but threats to take the children, threats to tell others the victim's personal stories, to emotionally blackmail them or humiliate them, threats to leave the relationship, sexual degradation. Sexual abuse actually plays a major role in domestic violence, and estimates are that within the framework of domestic violence relationships, approximately 60% or 3/5 of abusers have engaged in a type of sexual abuse against their victims. Professionally, I would say it's even higher than that, but when we think of sexual abuse, we tend to think of forcible rape or molestation. But in a controlling and abusive relationship, sexual abuse can often consist of repeatedly asking the victim to have sex when they do not want to, repeatedly asking for them to perform sex acts that they don't want to, comparing them sexually to others, or criticizing them for not performing like someone else. Sometimes abusers also work to sexually arouse and seduce the victim as a way to manipulate them emotionally, or they may approach the victim after the relationship's over to engage in sex so that they could destroy the current relationship or future relationships. Or they often pressure the victim to engage in sex in exchange for not escalating to a conflict. But for the victim, sex becomes something to be endured, something that is owed to the abuser. It's a means of survival to avoid worse consequences. And then they get told something's wrong with them because they aren't excited about being abused. It amounts to forcible rape, but by using emotional manipulation, coercion, pressure, threats of various forms in order to accomplish it, though physical force is often used as well. And unfortunately, we don't recognize this as a society, and even the victim is given the message that they should have just said no, but they were not allowed to. And they had their ability to say no and set boundaries systemically destroyed over time. Victims are also often faced with loss of housing, loss of food, finances if they leave the relationship, transportation, inability to provide for children, or facing the loss of children. Often they become so stressed from the abuse that their employment or schooling suffers, so further opportunities to take care of themselves or even escape are destroyed. We'll also often see victims turn to drugs and alcohol to cope with the abuse, or abusers may select victims who use drugs, which can then be used by abusers to threaten the victim that if they call the police, then the victim will be charged with illegal drug use, all to protect the abuser. Or if the abuser goes to jail, the victim loses their supply of drugs. Another form of control is sometimes the victim may threaten to commit suicide if the abuser may threaten to commit suicide if the victim doesn't do what they want. And some abusers will even tell the victim to kill them in order to stop the abuse. They'll often isolate their victims from family or friends or healthy social activities. They may monitor social media, text messages, show up at activities where the victim may be in order to check on the victim as further acts of control. Abusers also become adept at using looks, actions, gestures that will make the victim afraid. And many have gotten to where they can look at their victim in a certain way right across a crowded room with the message being sent that I'm going to hurt you, and get away with it right in public. Unfortunately, this happens a lot in courtrooms when victims face their abusers. The abusers will be glaring at them from across the courtroom, or scoffing at them in just such a way, right at the perfect time that they know is going to make the victim struggle, stress out, or choke out. Sometimes abusers start smashing things as a demonstration of physical power, or sending the message that this could be you, often rationalizing that they pay for the property, therefore they have the right to destroy it. They may destroy items of a sentimental worth to the victim, or of sentimental value to the relationship as a symbolic destruction of the relationship. They may even abuse pets as another type of emotional abuse, as a threat or as a warning. And animal abuse is actually one of the warning signs that are looked for in domestic violence evaluations and can indicate other severe behavioral issues or history, indicating that there are other issues that are likely happening that need to be looked into. Other types of abuse are what we call gaslighting. Engage in abuse and then tell the victim that they're overreacting, they're hysterical, or that the abuser is just kidding, or that it wasn't that bad. Meanwhile, the result is the victim's being driven crazy, questioning their sanity, questioning their own judgment, and slowly losing the ability to protect themselves or even leave the relationship or ask for help. And when the abuser finally escalates to physical violence, the second stage, or the explosion, abusers often portray their abuse as defending themselves, while often they deliberately provoke their victim to have to defend themselves. So they will antagonize their victim until the victim becomes physical as the only way to stop the abuse against them, and then the abuser calls the police on the victim and has the victim arrested for physical violence. Additionally, the violence often gets given a number of euphemisms to make it sound less damaging, such as putting hands on them or wrestling with them, when the reality is the victim couldn't have stopped the abuser if they wanted to. There wasn't really a with in that case. It was definitely against and being overpowered very often. Choking the victim versus strangling them or pushing them when they were struck or punched. Oftentimes the abuser will target parts of the body that the victim doesn't want to have photographed by the police so that the abuser can conceal their abuse on the victim, and the victim won't be willing to show anybody the evidence. And the victim's usually facing retaliation for having the police involved. But once the police leave, the abuse often continues behind closed doors, or it gets more creative and destructive. And as a result, victims will often defend their abusers to the police because they know it's coming. Or if they do report it, they'll often recant their story later when the pressure mounts, the threat of loss sets in, or retaliation becomes a reality. And oftentimes, the abusers will cite the fact that their victim defended them in court as evidence that they were innocent. But when we understand why, the fact that an abuser is being defended by their victim actually becomes an area of more concern. And victims defending their abuser, it changes nothing about what happened or what can or is likely to happen into the future. And this is one of the reasons why in the state of Idaho, the government takes over prosecution of domestic violence cases, because the victims are so frequently coerced into recanting by their abusers. The last stage of the cycle of violence is what we call the honeymoon stage. And in this stage, the abusers will often apologize to the victim. The victim gets money or other things that they've been wanting or needing all along. The abuser promises to get treatment. The victim will often apologize to the abuser for having provoked their attack on them. Makeup sex will be intense. And the victim now thinks that the relationship has now become healthy, or is going to, and the progress is going to be made, and the victim stays. I love you, and I'm sorry become words of manipulation, tools to keep power in the relationship for the abuser. And even while in jail, we'll see the abusers threatening the victim to recant, or making wonderful promises to change in order to manipulate the victim into helping the abuser avoid the consequences of their own actions. And very often they are successful in accomplishing this goal. But over time, promises to change get forgotten or ignored or deliberately set aside. Old patterns reemerge and the relationship enters the tension building stage all over again on the way back to another explosion. And meanwhile, society is asking, why didn't the victim leave? The answer is, they couldn't. Their self-esteem, confidence, and ability to stand up was taken over time. They become trapped for a number of reasons right in plain sight, while those who saw it from the outside too often do nothing, sending a message of hopelessness to the victim on every front and further sapping their ability to escape. And this cycle of violence tends to speed up over time. It gets shorter and shorter, with explosions getting more and more violent, even to the point of homicide or murder. And one of the biggest issues in all of this is society's desire to protect itself and not victims out of fear of being seen as overreacting. And we tend to minimize abuse in order to escape the responsibility for taking action. We tell ourselves, well, they were just screaming. It could be worse, when the reality is statistically, it's going to get worse. And yet, when we saw these things, we had a chance to stop it or take action or intervene or notify the appropriate authorities. I've worked with abusers who specifically went and told the neighbors ahead of time that if they heard screaming coming from the house, that they just argue loud and there's no need to call the police. The neighbors followed that advice, and the result was severe battery and near death. And the issue wasn't just the abuser, it was also the public, who were told beforehand that abuse was going to happen and helped the abuser by not taking action. And yet, if we saw this behavior in a work environment, in a break room, say with someone throwing things or trapping someone in a bathroom screaming about how they need to come out so that we can discuss the situation, or telling other employees, hey, if you hear screaming, we just have company meetings really loud in the other room, they'd be fired immediately, and the police would be called most likely. But for some reason, when it's at home with children, somehow we seem to think that this is okay. The reality is we don't want to be handling violence after the fact. We need to be recognizing the severe damage and or harm that are done before the violent act, taking action, and understanding why victims have such a hard time leaving, and tailoring our responses to help them get out of a situation they're quite literally trapped in so often. And we ultimately need to be recognizing that abuse is abuse, harm is harm, and abuse is a pattern, not an incident. This has been a really short overview. There is a lot more to go over on this subject. I'm going to be sharing more information in the future about a lot of the issues and dynamics touched on in this first video, but please share this. Recognize and learn to identify the things that are going on around you that are part of some of the things that are talked about here. Speak up, take action, and help when you can, but not, don't wait until it's too late, because the reality is we may not get a second chance. That's it for now, and thank you for listening.